Good morning, everyone. I hope you guys had a great weekend. This week, we are jumping into our new unit, and we'll be looking a little bit at the history of slavery in the U.S., and then moving forward, how did it impact America, how did it impact the people and culture at the time, and what are going to be some of the consequences that we deal with, including up to the Civil War, as well as today, the consequences that we have today because of the institution of slavery. Last week we finished up our unit on westward expansion, and so I wanted to shoot out a quick video going over the PowerPoint with you guys. So, slavery in the colonies. So our objectives for today is that you'll be able to describe the conditions under which enslaved Africans came to the Americas, explain why slavery became a part of the colonial economy, and then identify the restrictions placed on enslaved Africans in the colonies. So these three things we're hoping to understand, and our classwork for today is looking at Objective 1. What were the conditions under which enslaved Africans came to the Americas? So key terms and people. First one, triangular trade. This is the three-way trade between the colonies, the islands of the Caribbean, and Africa. The Middle Passage. This was the forced enslavement and relocations of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean. Racism. The belief that one race is superior or inferior to another. And lastly, slave codes, strict laws that restricted the rights and activities of slaves. So how did slavery develop in the colonies and affect colonial life? So first thing was that the Spanish and the Portuguese settlers were the first to bring enslaved Africans to the Americas. And if you remember, the Spanish and the Portuguese settlers were in the West Indies, Caribbean, Central, and South America. Slavery eventually spread to the colonies of other European countries, such as the British, what is now America, and it became a regular part of trade. It provided cheap labor to southern plantations and northern workers. So it very rapidly became adopted by the 13 colonies. The British, Dutch, and French entered the slave trade. So not only were enslaved Africans coming to the colonies, but the British colonists, the people who would later become America, start to actively ship and participate in the triangle trade, the transatlantic slave trade. And these are our 13 colonies here. Oftentimes, we say this is just something that happened in the South. That is incorrect. It happened across all of the colonies, and no one was really exempt from it. More than 10 million enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas between the 1500s and 1800s. How could they get this many people? It starts in Africa, where slave traders set up ports along the African coast. So Africa is a huge continent with different cultures, kingdoms, countries, peoples, languages. But on the western coast of Africa, slave traders set up ports. And then those who lived on the coast, the western coast, would move inland, make raids, kidnap, fight wars, and steal people from the interior of Africa and sell them to European slave traders. Because Africa was so large and the conditions were terrible, people had to march to the coast before they could get to the ships. About half of the captives died on these forced marches to the coast. Once they arrived at the coast, captives were traded for guns and goods. So Europeans would give guns and goods like rum, and in exchange for captives and enslaved Africans. Then they are brought across the Atlantic Ocean in what is now known as the Middle Passage. And we'll talk, this is what you'll be reading about, the conditions on the Middle Passage for the work today. So to increase profits, some European slave ship captains, right, crammed as many people, captives, on board. Once again, we'll be reading about the experiences of people on the ships, but knowing, right, that the conditions on these boats were so bad that it led to about 15 to 20% of enslaved Africans dying on the way there or committing suicide. Once they reached the Americas, those that were healthy were auctioned off. So enslaved Africans were then sold to whoever wanted them. Oftentimes families were separated. In total, about 500,000 enslaved Africans ended up in British North America. So only about 4.5% ended up in British North America. However, right, we'll see 41 ended up in the West Indies, the Caribbean, 37 in Portuguese Brazil, 15% ended up in Spanish America, and 2.5% ended up in Europe. So it's impacted the entirety of North and South America. This is a map of the triangular trade, right? The colonies here would buy sugar and molasses from the Indies, make rum, take rum to Africa in exchange for people. So this is the exodus of people out of Africa, the forced exodus. So the first leg, New England traders would sail to the Caribbean, where they traded fish and lumber for sugar and molasses. They would return back to New England, where they would make rum. Then the New English traders would sail to West Africa, where they traded the rum and guns and other supplies for slaves. The New England traders then sailed to the Caribbean islands, where they traded slaves for more molasses, so they could make more rum to trade more people. And so this became a triangle of trade that we will see in our map for today. This trade was illegal at the time. However, there was no one really enforcing the rules because it made them wealthy. The first enslaved Africans in the colonies, we don't have much documentation. At the beginning, it's possible that they were treated as servants, and some were eventually freed. However, this did not stay this way. Do not think that this was the way that it was. As the need for cheap labor grew, colonies made slavery permanent and inheritable. So not only were you enslaved for the rest of your life, but your kids were as well, and your kids' kids. And so it became not just a temporary state of being, but an entire lifetime and family's lifetime. Some colonies tried to ban slavery, but it is legal in every colony at some point or another. So why did slavery take root in the colonies? Why was it adopted so fast? One, the plantation system in the South depended on cheap and abundant labor. Things like rice, tobacco, cotton, they were labor intensive, and there weren't enough people to make as much as they wanted, to make as much money as they wanted. So they resorted to slavery, where they could not pay people. planters preferred slaves instead of indentured servants because, as we said, it became illegal for slaves to be freed. It became a lifetime sentence. Keep in mind that not every African in America was a slave. There was different reasons, right? Some had gotten freedom, but slavery became restricted to people of African descent. So eventually, slavery not only becomes, right, a system, but it was something that could only happen to people of African descent. And that is linked, right, to racism. So why was it only Africans and people of African descent who were enslaved? And that was because most English colonists thought they were superior to Africans, which in the course of world history is just incorrect. They thought it was their duty to convert Africans to Christianity and European ways as well. And they would do that, they thought, by taking them out of Africa and forcing them to work in a Christian country. However, the people that were enslaved did not go lightly. They fought for their freedom. They fought much like the colonies fought for their freedom from the British. The enslaved people fought and resisted white slaveholders. The first serious slave revolt took place in 1663, and this kicks off an understanding that we could fight back, and we'll actually look throughout history, the history of slave revolts, and you'll do some research on it next week. Because of these slave revolts and fears, right, colonial authorities wrote slave codes. These were rules about what slaves could and could not do. So if you were an enslaved person, you could not meet in large numbers or own a weapon. You could not leave a plantation without permission. And you could not learn to read and write. It was against the law. However, slave codes also dictated, right, that anyone who owned a slave, if that slave was died or murdered, it would not count as murder. However, these new codes did not stop resistance. In 1739, we see huge revolts in South Carolina and across the U.S. at multiple times. It is important to know, right, the lives of enslaved Africans were different depending on what region they lived in. So in the North, there was a much smaller population of enslaved Africans. And in the North, they often worked as blacksmiths or house servants or farm laborers. And over time, it's possible that there was a system of buying freedom, though not always, right? However, in the South, on the rice plantations, the cotton and tobacco area, they often just worked as farm laborers out in the fields, oftentimes a very labor-intensive crop. But there was a larger population. And because of this, in those areas, a lot of people who were enslaved were able to keep some of their customs from Africa. How to create baskets, keeping a language. All of these were very important to an identity that we'll talk a little bit more about. How identity became essential to resistance. Perfect. So if you go under, right, Schoology Week 7 on Monday, we are going to be reading about people's personal experiences with the slave trade and what conditions were like in the transatlantic slave trade for people that were brought to the colonies by Europeans. Keeping in mind, right, that these are primary sources, so languages are going to be possibly a little hard to read. Do your best. Some vocabulary we do not use in class, so read it. We won't use the terms in class. If you do have any questions, please let me know. Send me an email or sign up for a Google Meet. I hope you have a good day, and I will talk to you tomorrow.